Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Mathias, and I'm a sociologist and animal liberation activist from Denmark. I recently graduated from University of Copenhagen, and today I'm going to talk about the subject of my master's thesis, which I wrote together with a good friend and fellow activist, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. But with our thesis, we examined the case of Marius, as mentioned, the giraffe at Copenhagen Zoo, who was killed and publicly dissected in 2014. I assume you are familiar with the case. I'm going to begin this presentation with a brief outline of the Marius-dispute and our motivation to examine it, as well as how we did it. And then I'll present what we found in terms of what might be the potential of situations like the Marius-dispute and how to exploit that potential. And finally, I'll try to discuss the practical implications of our conclusion, and I look forward to hopefully hearing your thoughts on the matter. So, on the 5th of February 2014, the first Danish paper started reporting that Copenhagen Zoo planned to kill and publicly dissect Marius. And from that point and up till the 9th of February, where Marius was sadly killed, the story really snowballed on both social media and in international news media. Thousands of people signed petitions, and the debate sections of newspapers were almost dominated by the issue, and celebrities like these three were sharing their indignation on social media and so on. But Copenhagen Zoo did not succumb to any of this pressure. On the contrary, as the dispute evolved, the institution, the zoo, represented by this wonderful person, scientific director of Copenhagen Zoo, Bengt Holst, only became more insisting and confident in the justness of its actions. As the protests peaked, the zoo's defense kind of took the shape of an attack on the critics, and regrettably, this man came out of the dispute as the voice of reason, who was almost like heroically holding his position in a battle against a hysterical and sentimental mob. So I think what's interesting about the dispute over the killing of Marius is not only the magnitude of the protests and the debate that it sparked, but also its discursive and ideological influence. 3 years after, the dispute is still mentioned in the media from time to time, and at least within a Danish context, it's come to serve like a strong reference point in discussions and conversations about relations between humans and non-human animals. More specifically, it seems like the dispute kind of installed or solidified a very resilient narrative about the so-called disnification of nature. And in this narrative, empathy for non-human animals is dismissed as merely an expression of how distant people have supposedly come from nature, including animals. I'm going to get back to this, but first I'll try to say a little bit more about what initially drove us to examine the Marius-dispute. There's something very intriguing about these situations where the killing of particular non-human animals causes massive public indignation, as it happened in the case of Marius. Another example is the shooting of Cecil, the lion, in Zimbabwe. And cases like these can be seen as what you could call disruptions of speciesism. What's remarkable about these cases is that not only animal rights or liberation activists, but also lots of people who are neither vegans or vegetarians object heavily to instances of speciesist violence, and which is not usually recognized as unjust by the majority of people. And as sociologists and animal liberation activists, we identified a paradox. On the one hand, it's very heartening and uplifting to see these situational objections to violence and the very profound expressions of compassion for non-human animals. On the other hand, it's of course very problematic that these that the killing of certain non-human animals causes these reactions. Many of those who object to the killing of a lion or a giraffe see no reason to argue against the killing of other non-human animals for their flesh. So it's very tempting to dismiss these protesters as hypocrites and maybe even rage against them for their moral inconsistency, because it is frustrating. However, we felt that frustrations aside, these disruptions of speciesism also do inspire some amount of hope, because they prove that speciesism as a system is not as rock solid as it might appear. So we approach the Marius-dispute from a place of careful optimism, so to speak, and pose the following question. Do situations like the Marius-dispute hold any kind of potential in terms of furthering the course of animal liberation? And if so, what constitutes this potential? And in order to answer that question, we analyzed the debate over the killing of Marius and the dissection by categorizing the different forms of critique and justification that would put forward in Danish newspapers. And our analysis enabled us to discuss what really went on during the dispute and ultimately arrive at a question, an answer to a question. So what I'll do now is I'll present the main points and conclusions from this discussion. I just need some water. So, our most obvious finding was that the critique of the killing was of an inadequate nature. It was overwhelmingly anthropocentric and simply not radical enough. From our perspective, the killing of Marius would seem like the perfect occasion to raise a radical critique of a speciesist institution, that is the zoo, and maybe even of speciesist practices and relations in general. So why was the public indignation over the killing of Marius not channeled into a more fundamental and emancipatory critique? Part of the answer to this, we found, was that the dispute never evolved to be about zoos in general, because Copenhagen Zoo remained the isolated target of critique. By showing people what is standard practice in at least most European zoos, Copenhagen Zoo broke with the common and misguided notion of what a zoo is, namely a place that protects animals and takes good care of animals. But whether zoos in general live up to this notion of what a zoo is never really was called into question. Even though Copenhagen Zoo emphasized the normalcy of euthanizing so-called surplus animals, that is, animals who don't fit into the breeding programs of the zoo. I think this quote from a letter to the editor is very illustrative of this point. The zoo is the new slaughterhouse. Luckily, there are other wildlife parks you can visit in Denmark where the animals get to run freely around in the open areas and treated well. I'm done visiting zoo at Frederiksberg to see new baby animals when they're simply treated as feed for lions. So the dispute was never about zoos in general. And an extension of this point, it's important to note how the critics talked about Marius. Marius was constructed by the critics not as someone who deserves justice in terms of freedom from human captivity, but as, well, a zoo animal. That is someone who needs to be taken care of. And you can say he was kind of infantilized or pettified. These quotes are from a newspaper that invited people to say goodbye to Marius. And one reader says, "Sweet dreams, beautiful boy, thinking of your mother." And two children wrote, "Hope it's pleasant in the giraffe heaven." Almost like if they were saying goodbye to a family dog or something. So the point is that although the critics objected to the instrumental and objectifying perception of Marius represented by the zoo, their own way of speaking about Marius was kind of problematic as well, because he was not really recognized as the autonomous individual giraffe that he was, and also because it kept the debate locked on questions of good versus bad care instead of freedom versus captivity. We were not really surprised to find that the critique was inadequate, but having established this, we were able to move on to ask ourselves if situations like the Marius-dispute do hold a kind of potential to further animal liberation, and the potential is not the articulated critique, then what is it? And what we ended up was suggesting that the potential lies in the indignation. And in order to explain that, I need to elaborate on a certain understanding of what indignation is and what its role in critique is. Theoretically speaking, we can see critique as founded on an emotional primary level and a reflexive secondary level. Indignation then can be understood as an emotional expression of a fundamental ethical intuition. And it's based on this understanding of critique and indignation that we argue that the potential of situations like the Marius-dispute lies in this ethical energy that the indignation represents. But at the same time, we argue that the ethical energy is no good in itself. As a movement and as activists, we need to deliver on the reflexive level in order to channel the energy into a general, challenge the energy into a more strong critique that challenges the general inferior status of non-human animals in society. So, what does that mean that we need to deliver on the reflexive level? Well, we analyzed the debate and we found two important areas to react on. So firstly, we need to deconstruct what we call the disarmament of critique. And secondly, we need to validate the indignation that people has. By disarmament of critique, we refer to certain rhetorical maneuvers and manipulative narratives that undermine critique and shifts the focus of debates. And this is exactly what happened in the Marius-dispute, that the critique was disarmed, which is our third finding. The disarmament in the Marius-dispute took form as a very effective dismissal of the validity of empathetic impulses towards non-human animals. Copenhagen Zoo and its supporters managed to give life to this notion that showing empathy for non-human animals is an expression of disnification. And the disnification narrative contained these two accusations or claims. That firstly, that the critics were humanizing Marius, and secondly, that they had a distorted view of nature. And allow me to illustrate this with a few quotes. The first one is from of Peter Sandø, who's a professor in bioethics, and by the way, former chairman of the Danish Ethical Council for Animals. He was more or less sympathetic towards Copenhagen Zoo. Sorry. And he stated, Marius has been romanticized and Disneyfied to such an extent that it has obtained the status of a person. And so it's not surprising that some might feel disturbed by killing it just because it's in surplus. And then there's Bengt Holst stating to a newspaper, there's no point in us turning the world into a Disney world in which all animals are kind to each other and no one dies but are only born. That's a distorted world. I mean, that's hard to argue against, right? This is an official statement from the Copenhagen Zoo. Many people experience that a growing portion of the population become more and more distant from nature. This is why we find that we ought to communicate about nature as it is, rather than it is depicted in many cartoon movies. Again, hard to argue against. But both accusations that the critics were humanizing Marius and that they had a distorted view of nature were, of course, very misguided. In our thesis, we illustrated how there is basically no basis for saying these things. We didn't find any example of the critics humanizing Marius. The closest we came to it was like when people were saying boy or baby about him, but even these statements doesn't really illustrate that people were humanizing him. The point is that just because they regarded him as an individual, that doesn't mean humanizing. And in terms of the purportedly distorted view of nature, we pointed to the irony of the zoo positioning itself as an institution that represents a proper view of nature. A zoo enclosure for, say, giraffes is nothing like the habitat where free giraffes live, and a veterinarian shooting a giraffe is nothing like lions hunting down a giraffe and killing it to survive. I think if we look at these pictures from Copenhagen Zoo, it's very reasonable to ask who actually represents a distorted view of nature. And I've included the map of Copenhagen Zoo because I think it really illustrates how artificial and simulating the nature of a zoo is. So the point is that we need to attack twisted and false narratives like the one about disnification, and with a fancy phrase we can call this deconstructing the disarmament of critique. But besides this, we also need to validate the indignation that people feel and express. That is, we need to communicate why feeling and expressing empathy for non-human animals is not misguided, but on the contrary, very reasonable. And I think in that regard we need to draw on the wealth of research proving and indicating our evolutionary kinship with non-human animals. Fields like cognitive ethology, which is the study of non-human animal thought processes and consciousness, emotions, and social lives, provides us with valuable knowledge dismantling the still dominating notion of human exceptionalism. And it's such knowledge that supports the assertion that the critics were very reasonable to empathize with Marius. Their expression of compassion is in perfect accordance with what we know about who animals are. So they were right to regard him as an individual rather than the quasi-object that he was constructed as by Copenhagen Zoo, and their mass indignation that came to expression was essentially well-founded. And I think this is a really important message that we could have done more to get out there in this situation where Marius was killed. So I'm going to end this presentation with a few thoughts on how in practice we can exploit the potential of situations like the Marius-dispute, and also which challenges we face in this regard. And if we begin with the challenges, I'll mention two of them. The first one is avoiding anthropocentric language. Sorry. So we need to activate people's empathetic capacities by speaking of non-human animals as individuals who deserve justice, while avoiding the kind of stewardship discourse that characterized the critique in the Marius-dispute and which reduced Marius to a passive victim in need of human caregivers. That's one challenge. Another challenge is, and this is not really related to what I've been speaking about so far, but I think it's important to mention. Another challenge is avoiding problematic alliances and associations. I think we're all familiar with the issues of racism in campaigns like the international campaigns like against Dog Meat Festival in Yulin or against the massacre on dolphins in Taiji. Like the killing of Marius, Yulin and Taiji are strong sources of indignation to many people who are neither vegans or vegetarians. And unfortunately, there are people like these whose sympathy for non-human animals is often accompanied by racist attitudes to, for instance, Chinese people and Japanese people. And I think it's important to remember that those people are not our potential allies in the future situations like the Marius-dispute. And we should always call them out on their racism if we encounter it in situations where we are engaged as activists. So that's a couple of challenges. And finally, I want to raise the question of how to actually engage ourselves when the next Marius-dispute occurs. How in practice can we intervene the next time a large number of people object to a given instance of speciesist violence? And I see at least two different approaches. One is engaging directly with the protesters outside of our movement. And that means we can help them mobilize, try to put our mark on the framing, build bridges, and ultimately maybe attract new members to the movement. The other approach, which may be more cynical, is simply to use the momentum of situations like the Marius-dispute to communicate the message of animal liberation, and rather than engage with the protesters outside of our movement, attempt to take the lead and become the loudest and clearest voice of the situation. Yeah. So that's two approaches at least. So to recap, situations like the Marius-dispute holds a potential to further animal liberation. That potential is the public indignation. Exploiting that potential is a matter of channeling the indignation, this ethical energy, into strong anti-speciesist critique by deconstructing the disarmament of critique and validating empathy for non-human animals. How to best do that in practice is an open question, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mathias. And now I open up the floor for questions, comments, thoughts. Anyone? Yes, please come here and give your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. Quick question, do you know of any long-term consequences for the zoo or zoo industry in Denmark from this incident?
Well, unfortunately, I think Copenhagen Zoo only became stronger, got a better image actually, because they won the debate. Yeah, it only seems like the zoo has a stronger image as an institution that educates people and undisneyfy people's view of the world, kind of. Yeah, so I think the Copenhagen Zoo is much stronger now. And there's been cases like the Marius killing of Marius afterwards that hasn't been protested like it was the case with the Marius-dispute. So yeah, so that just shows that it's really important to intervene when we have these situations to try to influence the discourse and the ideological content of the dispute.
May I ask a follow-up question? Because I mean, they got so heavily criticized in the media worldwide. Didn't they think that that was problematic? That, I mean, killing a giraffe must have been seen by them as a kind of hard to get that kind of criticism. No?
Yeah, I think the recipe to success for Bengt Holst and his colleagues was that they simply didn't accept any of the criticism. They kept repeating their own message, insisting on the justness of doing what they did, and at the end that maybe it also one important factor was that people starting to I think many Danes were offended by the international critique, so it took like a nationalist angle, and Bengt Holst managed to become this patriarch defending our country almost in international news interviews and stuff. So that's maybe an important factor as well.
Anyone else? Yes.
For me, this is also about a scientific dispute. Do you see how we as activists effectively can work with scientists in a way that further animal liberation?
Yeah, I'm personally very interested in the field that I mentioned, cognitive ethology, that is quite progressive in terms of recognizing non-human animals as persons and individuals, and, conscious beings. So I think we should really try to lean on the knowledge from disciplines like that, and to prove that we know about the world and nature, and we're not like these alienated vegans who just think that we live in a Disney world. Because there is something to lean on within biology, and I think Bengt Holst's view of biology is, I would say it's quite outdated. And that would be should be quite easy to undermine his authority as a scientist.
Thank you. Anything else? I had a question. This was a big media event, of course, also in Denmark. Did anyone ask the animal rights movement to have a comment about this? Were you invited to the TV sofas and so on, morning programs?
No, not that I recall or what I've seen. I know that Toby from Anima wrote one really good debate piece. I don't remember I think it was after his death, right? Yeah.
Okay, so there was this program called Deadline, which is like the serious news, not viewed by so many people, but it's kind of very influential. So they just want to use the animal rights community as talking about the like moral things a little bit, and also just being the expert on giraffes. So I had to do some Googling about giraffes in nature, and how fast can they run, and how great are they, do they live in like nice families and these kind of things, to kind of make the image about how life in a zoo is very different from life in nature, and why do we have zoos? Do we have them for the sake of the animals or for the sake of people and entertainment? But it wasn't a direct debate, it was just me talking to the journalist, which is a really good journalist, and then he was trying to kind of grill this guy, Bengt Holst. But to me, like, this zoo guy, he was very, very good as having his own kind of opinion on things, and it seems there are very few people who have like these really good arguments when you talk about like the whole institution of zoos and animals in captivity and animal rights in general. So he came out just kind of using his own scientific sort of zoo language, and like, what can a journalist do who is not really much into these kind of argument things? So it seems to me that if we want to win these debates, we really need like strong spokespeople who really like know the whole zoo industry and the whole zoo business, and then also know the animal rights theory, but can make it into kind of an everyday situation so people can relate with it in terms of maybe their pets or what they eat, and zoos and like animals and entertainment and all kinds of things, so you can connect it also to the Taiji dolphin thing, because it's also some sort of entertainment that you take, and then you can kind of have this kind of discussion. But I think it's very hard to do when you just have this scientific institution doing kind of science arguments, and also, as you said, in the international news, he came out as a winner with this British TV guy just asking these kind of outrageous questions. So, isn't it wrong to kill a giraffe? And he was like, well, no, this is what we do in zoos, and we do it all the time, and like you do it in England also. And he was like, oh, okay. and then everybody was like sharing this video. Yeah, you tell that like sensational journalist how we do things in zoos and in Denmark, and yeah, that kind of watered out the debate, and it didn't get that serious, actually, I would think.
Yeah, so that interview is really a good example of how weak the critical voices were, because he was just very, there's nothing but indignation. It's just like no arguments, no. And also I didn't mention this, but a lot of the indignation was a result of the decision to publicly dissect Marius. I mean, that's two different things: killing him and dissecting him. And a lot of the indignation was a result of the decision to dissect him even in front of children. I think that's what a lot of American media didn't like get at all.
I was thinking about that. Being in a neighboring country of Sweden, I remember a Swedish animal park boss being in TV and saying, yeah, okay, we do the same things, but we don't do it publicly. That they do in Copenhagen. That, I mean, we would never do that because that's wrong. Because you can, And I was thinking about that. I mean, that's the same thing in slaughterhouses. They never do it publicly. That's why maybe we don't problematize. I mean, the public don't see it as very problematic because it's not shown.
Yeah,
have you been thinking about that? Yeah, more.
And I think I'm quite worried that that there are great consequences of this Marius case, because I think there is a tendency that people start thinking that their kids should see where their food comes from and see chickens get their throat slit and stuff like that, and that is like good education for children to witness killing and dissections and stuff like that. And yeah, it's troublesome, I think.
So you think if Copenhagen Zoo, I mean, they are still gonna kill animals? You think they will continue doing it publicly? And have they done that?
They are
after.
Yeah.
I mean, not the killing, but the abduction.
Yeah, but they are, and all other zoos in Denmark are as well, and museums. I know museums doing it as well. So it's quite common, and it was before Marius. But it's for some reason this. It's just a matter of one journalist like pursuing the story to begin with, and then for some reason it became this as big as it did. Maybe because he was a very young giraffe or something. I don't know. What?
And it had a name.
Yeah. It was another big issue with the debate, and afterwards Copenhagen Zoo has stated that they don't want to give any animals names in the future because that's just distorting people's view of nature. Yeah.
Yes, anyone else? I can say also that I hear that a lot, not just about Marius and zoo animals, but the critique of disnification is all around. Where we talk about farm animals as individuals, we get that also. Yeah. Just by saying that they have emotions or behaviors that are sometimes similar to us. And that's a common critique, isn't it?
Yeah, and even though, as we've heard in presentations here, reason is not very important when it comes to people's moral decisions, I think that people react really positive if they perceive people as being reasonable. So, yeah, that's the problem, and people want to be rational and not live in a. Who wants to live in a Disney world? I mean, so. Yeah.
Anything else? Well, thank you, Mathias, for bringing this to us.